The moment I stepped through the front door of that restaurant, I heard Vanessa say it. "And here he is, our little maple man." She said it to her mother's friends, loud enough to carry across the room, and she smiled when she said it. That practiced smile that never quite reached her eyes. A few people laughed politely. Someone raised a glass in my direction, and I just stood there in my pressed shirt, the one I'd spent 20 minutes ironing, because I wanted to look right, and I felt the room rearrange itself around a single sentence. "My name is Harvey Bellingham. I'm 63 years old. I've run a 200-acre maple operation outside of Barrie, Ontario for 37 years. My grandfather planted the first stand of maples in 1951. My father expanded the tapping lines in the 70s. I inherited it in my late 20s and poured every year of my working life into it. I own the land outright. I owe no one a cent. I raised my son Colton on that property, taught him to read a tree's sap run by the frost, to pull a stuck truck out of spring mud, to eat supper before dark because the bush doesn't care about your schedule. I buried my wife Margaret 4 years ago this past March. We were married 31 years. She knew that farm the way some women know their own kitchens. Every corner, every season, every smell. The night I'm telling you about, my son Colton was getting engaged, and I had driven 2.5 hours from Barrie to Toronto for a dinner I was genuinely looking forward to. Within 30 seconds of walking in, I felt like I'd shown up to the wrong party. The woman who said it, Vanessa Holloway, was standing at the center of a small circle near the bar, holding her wine glass by the stem the way people do when they're performing composure. Her mother, Cheryl, was beside her, wearing a blazer that probably cost more than my truck payment. A handful of their family friends orbited them like they'd been doing it for years. Nobody said a word after the laugh. A couple of people glanced at me, registered that I'd heard it, and then looked back at their drinks. And that was the worst part. Not the joke itself, but the way the room just absorbed it and moved on. Like the air didn't change. Like I hadn't been standing right there. I felt my jaw tighten. I looked down at my hands, calloused, wide, stained faintly at the knuckles the way 37 years in the sap lines will do. And for one moment I saw them the way she must have. Wrong for this room. Out of place. I was turning back toward the door. Honestly, I was leaving. And then Colton was beside me. He put a hand on my arm and leaned in close. "Dad," his voice was low and steady. "Hold on, just tonight." Just tonight. No explanation. No apology for what I'd just heard. He looked at me with something I hadn't seen in him before. Not embarrassment, not anxiety. Something quieter and more deliberate. The look of a man who already knows exactly how the evening is going to go, and needs you to trust him long enough to get there. I stayed because of him. Not because I wanted another hour in that room. Not because the Holloways had earned my patience. I stayed because in 32 years my son had never once given me cause to doubt him. And if he was asking me to hold on, he had a reason. If you've ever swallowed something that sat wrong, not because you agreed with it but because someone you love asked you to wait, then you already know how heavy that feels, walking back into a party that just told you exactly what it thinks of you. I spent the rest of that dinner doing what you do, handshakes. Answering questions about the farm from people who clearly knew nothing about maple operations and weren't especially interested in learning. Adrian Holloway, Vanessa's father, talked about real estate like a man conducting a seminar. Acquisitions, development timelines, waterfront property in the Muskokas. His wife Cheryl steered every conversation back to their Rosedale address or their son's firm. Every question anyone asked me felt calibrated, not curious but bracketing, like they were establishing exactly how far below the line I stood. Vanessa herself was poised and warm and said all the right things. She touched Colton's arm when she spoke about him. She laughed at the right moments. But now and then I caught her glance moving over me the same way it had when I walked in, assessing, categorizing, filing me away somewhere useful. I thought about Margaret that night. She had a gift for reading people that I never managed to develop properly. She could clock a compliment that landed a beat too precisely, a smile that had no warmth behind it. She was almost never wrong about anyone. I'd been 4 years without her by then, and I still heard her voice sometimes in quiet moments. Sitting at that table, I already knew what she would have said about Vanessa Holloway inside the first 5 minutes. I just hadn't wanted to hear it yet. Because the truth is, my unease hadn't started that evening. It had started almost 18 months earlier, the first time Colton brought Vanessa out to the farm. She was polished and intelligent and perfectly pleasant. My son was happy, and at the time, honestly, that was enough for me to open the door wide. I walked her the property line. I showed her the sugar shack, the pipeline grids, the old stand my grandfather had marked with an axe notch in 1953. Most people ask questions when they walk a piece of land because they want to understand it. Vanessa asked questions the way you'd complete a form. square footage of the sugar shack, how many taps per tree, whether the property was in a conservation easement, what the assessed value came back at on the last MPAC notice. I told myself it was just her background. Commercial real estate, of course she thought in those terms. Now I wonder what I was really doing. I think I was handing her an explanation so I wouldn't have to sit with the actual answer. Meeting her parents confirmed something I'd been avoiding. Adrian Holloway talked about other people's assets the way most men talk about weather. Casually, as though it were simply part of the landscape he moved through. Cheryl was smoother, harder to place. She asked questions that weren't quite insults but left a mark anyway. Do maple farms still generate a real income these days, Harvey? Or is it more of a heritage thing at this point? Every conversation with them felt less like family and more like a quiet audit I hadn't agreed to sit for. But Colton was happy. So every time something tightened in my gut, I told myself I was just a widower who'd spent too long alone on 200 acres, seeing shadows that weren't there. Standing in that restaurant that night, replaying Vanessa's laugh, I finally stopped lying to myself. I hadn't been too suspicious of this family. I'd been nowhere near suspicious enough. Less than 2 hours later, my son was going to show me exactly how right that feeling had been. The dinner broke up just after 9. People collected their coats. I was headed for the parking garage, ready to drive back to Barrie and try to sleep, when Colton fell in beside me on the sidewalk. "Come back to my place, Dad. There's something I need to show you." His voice was the same as it had been at the restaurant, controlled, deliberate, underneath it something heavier. His apartment was 15 minutes away. When we got there, he didn't offer tea, didn't sit down, just went straight to his laptop on the kitchen table and turned it to face me. "Before I open this," he said, "I need you to let me get through all of it. Don't say anything until I'm done." I nodded. He opened a folder, audio files, more than a dozen, each one dated and labeled going back 10-12 weeks. He pressed play on the first one. Background noise at first, dishes, a television somewhere, the ambient hum of a kitchen. Then a voice came through clean. Vanessa's, easy and unguarded, nothing like the version she wore in public. 8 more weeks, she said, then it gets much simpler. Another voice answered, Cheryl's, low, agreeable. Vanessa again, Colton's not the complicated part, he never was. I shifted in my chair. Once we're through the ceremony, I start the title conversation. Dad's already spoken to the buyers. A pause. The timing is the only thing that matters now. I sat very still. Title conversation, buyers. I looked at Colton, he kept his eyes on the screen. The recording continued. Cheryl, and if Harvey doesn't cooperate. Vanessa, without hesitating. He won't be the problem. Men like him defer to their sons, that's the whole point. The apartment felt smaller suddenly. My pulse was loud in my own ears. I wasn't angry yet. I was something else, a kind of cold, slow confusion, the sort you feel when something you thought you understood starts to come apart at the seams. Colton let the silence sit for a moment after the file ended. Tell me that's not what it sounds like, I said. He opened the second folder. Documents this time. Emails, maps, scanned paperwork. He walked me through them without rushing, the way you explain something to someone you care about, laying each piece down gently even when the pieces are terrible. How long have you known? I asked. Long enough to know the dinner tonight was staged. They wanted you seen in that room before the next step. He pulled up a map, provincial planning style, with a corridor drawn in orange across a grid of parcels. He zoomed in slowly. My land sat in the center of it. What is that? A transit corridor, he said quietly. Provincial. They haven't made the announcement yet, still in the environmental assessment phase. I stared at the screen. The orange line ran straight through the south quarter of my property, through the oldest stand of maples on the farm, through the field my father first cleared, through ground my family had worked for 70 years. If this corridor goes through, Colton said, your land value could increase 6 to 10 times within 3 years. Maybe more. It all depends on timing. Every question Vanessa had asked on that first visit came back to me at once. None of it had been curiosity. She'd been building a file on me before she'd ever sat at my kitchen table. How much are we talking? I asked, though part of me didn't want the answer. On 200 acres at that location, in today's market before the announcement? He paused. Probably between 2 and 4 million. Some estimates go higher, depending on what the province pays for expropriation easements. I leaned back and thought about my grandfather's axe notch on the old maple in the south stand. About the sap lines my father ran by hand through ground that froze solid every November. About Margaret the first autumn she spent on that property, learning to read the trees alongside me. saying she'd never understood how something so cold could produce something so sweet. To me, that land was everything that had ever mattered. To the Holloways, apparently, it was a transaction waiting to close. Colton opened another file, an email chain, addresses I didn't recognize discussing acquisition targets and transfer timing. One name kept appearing in the CC line. Adrian Holloway. He's behind this? He's been behind it from the beginning, but it gets worse. He scrolled to a scanned document. I didn't understand what I was looking at for a moment. Then I did. My name, Harvey Bellingham, printed at the top of a property pre-authorization form, the kind used to initiate a transfer agreement through Registry Ontario, and at the bottom a signature. My signature, except it wasn't. That's not my hand, I said. No, Colton agreed, it isn't. He opened another, then another. 4 documents total, each one bearing a version of my signature close enough to fool a scan, not close enough to fool the man whose name it was supposed to be. The anger arrived then, not hot but cold and very precise, not rage at the money, rage at the arrogance. Someone had looked at the whole shape of my life. 37 years of work, a family's inheritance, land my grandfather had refused to sell during the hardest years of his life, and decided they could reduce it to a form with a forged name at the bottom. Without asking me, without offering me anything, as though I weren't even a participant in my own story. How long has this been going on, I asked. The documents go back 14 months. 14 months, a year of Sunday dinners, Christmas at the farm, letting Vanessa walk every corner of my property because I believed my son was happy and that was enough for me. There's more, Colton said. He pulled up a video, grainy, clearly captured without anyone's knowledge, a phone propped somewhere in a home office. Adrian Holloway at a desk, talking to another man I didn't recognize, papers spread between them. He tapped a file near his right hand, and even through the bad angle and the low resolution, I could read my own name on the tab. The Bellingham parcel is the anchor, Adrian said. Everything else in this corridor depends on us controlling that piece before the provincial announcement goes public. The other man said something I couldn't catch clearly. Adrian leaned back in his chair. We're already inside the family, the hard part is done. I watched this on my son's laptop in his small apartment in Toronto and felt the floor shift under my chair. This hadn't been a relationship that went wrong. This had been a strategy that used a relationship as its entry point. The distinction matters. I'd spent months telling myself that Colton had simply fallen for the wrong woman. The truth was worse. Vanessa may have approached him in the first place, specifically because of what sat on his father's property. When did you start suspecting her, I asked. About 11 weeks ago, she left her laptop open at my place. I saw a folder name I didn't expect. He paused. I didn't open it that night. I closed the lid and went to bed and lay there for 3 hours wondering if I was wrong. Then I thought about you, and I opened it. Why didn't you come to me then? He looked at me directly. Because if I'd come to you then, you would have confronted them. And they would have buried everything before anyone could document it. I needed them to believe they were winning. I sat with that for a long time. My son had spent 11 weeks going through cake tastings and venue walkthroughs and future planning conversations, smiling through all of it while quietly building a case against the woman beside him. Most people would have gone straight to confrontation. Colton had done something harder. He'd waited, documented, built it piece by piece until there was nowhere left for them to go. So what happens now, I asked. He reached into the front pocket of his jacket and placed a small USB drive on the table between us. The engagement party is Saturday, he said, and they think everything is on schedule. He looked at me the way he had outside that restaurant, calm, certain, carrying something he'd decided he was ready to put down. It isn't, he said. I drove back to Barrie close to midnight, didn't sleep. The highway was dark and mostly empty, and I spent most of those 2.5 hours going over the same ground in my head. Audio files, forged documents, Vanessa's voice saying the words she thought no one outside that kitchen would ever hear. When you've spent 37 years building something honest, and you find out someone has been working to take it from you for over a year, you don't feel clever for surviving it. You feel the weight of every meal you shared with them. Every conversation you took at face value. Every Sunday you let them walk your land because you believed they would one day be your family. That's not anger, that's grief with sharper edges. Colton called early Saturday morning and asked me to come back to the city. When I arrived at his apartment, a woman I hadn't met was already there, setting up equipment at the dining table. Projector, cables, 2 laptops, a small portable speaker. Her name was Frederica, an old university friend of Colton's who ran audiovisual production for corporate events across southern Ontario. "We're nearly ready," she said without looking up. Colton walked me through the sequence. Recordings first, arranged in chronological order. Then the documents, the emails, the maps, the provincial corridor planning materials his contact had helped verify. Then the forged signatures, each one placed side by side with a sample of my actual handwriting from a legitimate document. Every claim supported by something you could hold in your hand. "The venue knows about this?" I asked. Frederica smiled briefly. "They think it's a surprise presentation for the couple." I didn't laugh, but I understood the irony clearly enough. The Holloways had spent 14 months believing they were the ones staging everything. They had no idea they were about to walk into something staged far more carefully than they'd ever managed. Colton reviewed the sequence twice more, watching him work, precise, methodical, not one wasted move. I understood something I hadn't before. This wasn't just about stopping the scheme. It was about making sure they couldn't rewrite the story afterward. No witnesses meant no record. No record meant the Holloways could reconstruct the narrative somewhere else, and find the next family who trusted too easily. "You could have walked away from this quietly," I said. "Ended the engagement. Moved on. They'd never have gotten the land." He was quiet for a moment. They'd have found someone else. Another family, another piece of property, another son who trusted the wrong person. He looked at me steadily. I couldn't leave that door open. There was nothing left to argue with. Whatever came next in that room, I was standing beside him through every second of it. Before I left for the venue, Colton stopped me at the door. "Dad." I turned. "Whatever happens in there, don't step in, let me finish." The engagement party was at a restored event space near the distillery district. High ceilings, exposed brick, long tables with white linen. About 120 people, family from both sides, the Holloways' professional contacts, Colton's friends from university and work. Everyone dressed up and in good spirits, waiting for the kind of afternoon that goes exactly the way you expect it to. Adrian Holloway worked the room like a man receiving an award. Cheryl stood near the front, composed and warm, accepting congratulations with the fluency of someone who had practiced it for decades. And Vanessa, I'll say this plainly, was radiant, greeting every guest by name, every smile landing perfectly, every word chosen correctly. She had been doing this for 14 months. She was very good at it. Colton stood near the front of the room, speaking quietly with Frederica and two of his friends positioned near the back. If anyone had looked carefully, they might have noticed something different about the way he carried himself that afternoon. Not nerves, not excitement, the particular stillness of someone who has already decided and is simply waiting for the moment. Adrian tapped a glass around 2 o'clock. The room quieted. He welcomed everyone with the confidence of a man who believed the day belonged entirely to him. He spoke about Vanessa, about Colton, about the future they were building together. A few people dabbed their eyes. Glasses were raised. Then he handed the floor to the couple. Vanessa spoke first, warmly, beautifully, exactly the right things in exactly the right order. She reached for Colton's hand. And then Colton spoke. "Before we go any further," he said, "I want to make sure everyone in this room has the full picture." The shift was immediate. Confusion, mostly. A few uncertain smiles. Adrian's expression flickered just slightly, then steadied. The screen at the front of the room lit up. At first, no one understood what they were looking at. Then Vanessa's voice filled the room. Her own voice, relaxed and unguarded. The voice she used when she wasn't performing. 8 more weeks, then it gets much simpler. People looked at each other. A few looked at Vanessa. She had gone very still. Colton's not the complicated part. He never was. The confusion began to shift towards something else. "Once we're through the ceremony, I start the title conversation. Dad's already spoken to the buyers." I watched Adrian from where I stood near the side of the room. His jaw tightened. He did not move. Then Cheryl's voice from the recording. "And if Harvey doesn't cooperate?" And Vanessa without a breath of hesitation. "He won't be the problem. Men like him defer to their sons. That's the whole point." The sound that moved through that room was not a gasp. It was quieter than that. More like a collective intake of breath that nobody released all at once. A woman near the front covered her mouth with both hands. Several people turned to look at me. I kept my eyes on my son. The second recording started immediately. Adrian's voice this time in his home office, talking timelines and acquisition targets. Then, "The Bellingham parcel is the anchor. Everything else in the corridor depends on us controlling that piece before the provincial announcement goes public." Adrian was on his feet. "Stop this. This is fabricated. This is an invasion of..." Nobody moved to turn it off. The documents came up next, the email chains, the provincial corridor map with my land at its center, then the forged authorization forms, my name printed across the top of each one, the false signature at the bottom. Colton spoke quietly over the noise building in the room. That signature is not my father's. I have his original documents here for comparison, and a handwriting analysis commissioned 3 weeks ago that confirms the discrepancy. He placed a folder on the table in front of him. Frederica had a second one at the back of the room. Vanessa stepped toward him. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Colton, we can talk about this privately. We could have, he said. You had 14 months. The room had stopped pretending. Phones were out everywhere. A young woman near the window, one of Vanessa's friends, I think, someone who'd clearly had no idea what she'd been part of, was crying quietly into a napkin. Cheryl had gone pale and hadn't spoken in several minutes. Adrian was pointing, saying things that no one was listening to anymore. And Vanessa, for the first time since I'd met her, Vanessa was crying. Real tears. Not because she was sorry. Because the room had left her, and I think that had never happened to her before in her life. I want to be honest about what I felt watching all of it. I had expected to feel vindicated. What I actually felt was tired. The particular exhaustion of carrying something for too long and finally being allowed to set it down. 14 months of Sunday dinners with people who had already run the numbers on my entire life. A year of letting Vanessa through my front door, onto my property, into stories about Margaret, into the parts of my life I don't share easily. And underneath all of it, a scheme that had never been about my son, or about a future, or about anything real at all. That weight lifted off my shoulders all at once. The relief wasn't clean, but it was real. A man stood up near the center of the room. He wasn't loud about it. That's what made people pay attention. My name is Philip Strand, he said. I'm a Crown Attorney with the Ministry of the Attorney General. I was here today as a personal guest. He looked across the room toward the Holloway table, with the calm of a man who has delivered difficult news before. Based on what has been presented, I would strongly advise the individuals implicated here not to leave this venue before speaking with counsel. Whatever composure the Holloways had left evaporated on the spot. Forged property transfer documents, Philip continued, along with documented evidence of a coordinated scheme to defraud a landowner, constitute serious criminal offenses under the Criminal Code of Canada. Possession and use of fraudulent instruments carries its own charges. I'd recommend everyone involved say nothing further until you've spoken to a solicitor. Adrian sat down. Vanessa glanced toward the door. 2 of Colton's friends, quiet, large men I recognized from his university years, were already standing near the exit, not blocking it, just making the calculation visible. She didn't move. She looked around that room at 120 people who had turned to face her, and she understood, perhaps for the first time in her life, that there was nowhere left to go. She sat down and put her face in her hands. 2 OPP officers arrived 20 minutes later. The room went quiet the moment they walked in. 120 people watching them cross the floor directly to the Holloway table, speaking to Adrian and Cheryl in low professional voices. Vanessa sat separately, still, hands in her lap. I stood near the back of the room and watched it happen. Colton came and stood beside me. Neither of us said anything for a while. Eventually I put my hand on his shoulder. That was enough. What came after took time, the way these things always do. The OPP referred the matter to a financial crimes unit within weeks. Frederica's recordings were examined by audio forensics. The handwriting expert who had worked with Colton testified clearly to the forged signatures, and investigators, once they began pulling the thread, found considerably more than anyone had anticipated. The Holloway family's finances, as it turned out, were in far worse shape than their Rosedale address suggested. 3 development projects had gone sideways in the previous 2 years. Loans leveraged against properties that had underperformed. The version of success they'd projected into every room they entered was largely borrowed time and borrowed money. When a contact inside provincial planning had tipped Adrian off about the corridor, my land hadn't been an opportunity in the ordinary sense. It had been a lifeline. That's when the full shape of it finally made sense to me. They hadn't come after my farm because they were greedy in some abstract way. They came after it because they were desperate. And desperation makes people willing to go further than you'd believe. It didn't excuse anything, but it explained the arrogance, the forged signatures, the manufactured relationship, the certainty in Vanessa's voice on those recordings. When you're genuinely panicking underneath a performance of confidence, you start to believe you can get away with anything. Then other people started coming forward. A family from Orangeville contacted investigators after local news picked up the story. Years earlier, their daughter had been briefly involved with a man connected to Adrian Holloway's development network. The relationship had drifted, strangely and specifically, toward questions about her family's rural property before ending abruptly. A couple from outside Collingwood came forward with a pattern that traced the same shape. None of the stories matched exactly, but together they drew a picture that made everything clearer. What happened at that engagement party hadn't just ended one scheme. It had given other people permission to say something they'd been carrying alone. Months before the case went to trial, the Holloway's solicitors requested a meeting. Colton and I sat across a boardroom table from them in downtown Toronto and listened to their offer. A significant settlement, a joint statement, and a request that we withdraw our cooperation with the Crown. The number was real. I won't pretend it didn't register. I sat with it for about a minute. Then I thought about my grandfather's axe notch on the old maple in the south stand. About the first winter Margaret spent at the farm, refusing to complain about the cold even when the pipes froze twice in February. About Colton at 7 years old, learning to tap a tree by watching me do it first. I thought about the family in Orangeville. The couple from Collingwood. No, I said. The solicitor looked at me evenly. May I ask why? Because if we take this, I told him, someone else's farm becomes the next one. The trial was thorough and took most of a year. Recordings, documents, expert testimony on the forged signatures, financial records showing the true depth of the Holloway's position. By the time closing arguments came around, I watched something leave Adrian Holloway's face that I didn't think was coming back. The particular quality of a man who has always believed he was the most prepared person in any room. There's no buying that back once it goes. The verdicts came down 14 months after an engagement party that never became a wedding. Adrian received the longest sentence. Cheryl was convicted on related charges, her sentencing shorter but consequential and lasting. Vanessa sat without expression as the judge spoke. She looked, for the first time since I'd known her, like someone who had finally understood that the shape of a consequence is permanent, that it arrives on its own schedule, not yours, and it doesn't negotiate. Colton and I walked out of the courthouse in the rain, the way you walk out of a place where something long and exhausting has finally at last been put to rest. 2 years on from all of it, things are different in the ways that count. My son spends more time in Barrie than he used to. About 10 months after the trial, he started seeing a woman named Anwin, a wetlands ecologist he'd met through a conservation project. His firm was consulting on north of Huntsville. The first time she came out to the farm, she walked the property line without once asking about assessed value or square footage. What she asked about was the soil composition under the sugar maple stand, and whether I'd noticed any shifts in the sap run timing over the last decade. She said climate data was suggesting subtle but measurable changes in Ontario's maple belt, and she wanted to understand what that looked like on the ground, from someone who actually worked it. That was the moment I knew exactly who she was. They got engaged quietly last autumn under the old maples in the south stand. My grandfather's maples, the ones the corridor map had run a line straight through. No venues, no orchestration, no performance. Just the two of them and a small circle of people who actually belonged there, standing in the same dirt that had refused to be sold. I think about that restaurant sometimes, about the words Vanessa said, and the way the room absorbed them like they were nothing. For a few minutes that night, I felt the weight of someone else's assessment pressing down on everything I'd built. The particular smallness of being looked at and found lacking. And I want to be honest, it stung. Not because I believed her, but because contempt delivered in public has a way of reaching inside you before you can stop it, even when you know it's wrong. What I understand now is that those words were never really about me. They were a confession about the person who said them. People who measure a man by the state of his hands, the wear on his jacket, the work he does with his back instead of behind a desk. They aren't revealing anything about you. They're showing you the ledger they use to measure the world, and the fact that you appear in it as a line item says everything about them and nothing about you. The mistake is absorbing it as truth instead of recognizing it as information. What Colton understood, in those 11 weeks he spent quietly, methodically building something no one could argue with, was that patience isn't passivity, that waiting for the right moment isn't the same as staying silent, that some things deserve to be ended completely and on the record, because the people who will be next deserve the chance to never have to go through it at all. I'd ask you to do one thing after hearing this. The next time your gut tells you something is off about a person, not a reason you can put into a sentence, just a feeling that sits in your chest and won't quite leave, write it down somewhere. Note the date, not to accuse anyone, just so you have it later if later ever comes. And here's something worth sitting with tonight. Is there someone in your life right now who has made you feel smaller, quietly and consistently, just by the way they see you? Think about that. My land is still here. The maples are still running. My grandfather's name is still in the chain of title going back to 1951. Some mornings I walk the south stand before the rest of the day starts, and I think about everything it took to keep this piece of ground in this family. And I remind myself of the one thing this whole long ordeal came down to. You are not what someone else decides you're worth. Drop a 1 in the comments if you think Colton should have confronted Vanessa the moment he found those files. A 2 if you think waiting and building the case was the right call. Or a 3 if you're still turning it over. Tell me where you're watching from and what the weather's like where you are. I read every one of those. And if any part of this landed close to home for you, I want to hear that too. Thank you for staying with me through this one. If stories about family, betrayal, and the slow, steady shape of justice mean something to you, stick around and subscribe. There's another one coming, and I think you'll want to be here for it. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully reimagined and rewritten as original content. Any resemblance to real persons or events is coincidental.